Before we begin, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a story like this. And if you enjoy powerful emotional journeys, share this video and check out the others on the channel. Now let's dive in. Hannah Collins had never imagined that her life could shrink to the size of 2 worn-out duffel bags and the trembling hand of her 7-year-old son pressed into her palm. Only a few hours earlier, she had still been inside the house she had lived in for years. Moving quietly through the morning routine she knew so well, preparing lunch for her son, tidying the kitchen, asking politely if her in-laws needed anything before she rushed to her shift. She had convinced herself that things, while strained, were bearable. She believed she simply needed time to save a little, time to get on her feet, time to breathe after the losing battle of grieving her husband. But time had betrayed her the way people sometimes did, quietly, abruptly, by running out. The Nebraska afternoon had been unseasonably cold when she returned home after her shift, her fingers stiff from the walk to the bus stop and from the biting wind. She had imagined stepping into warmth, maybe hearing Evan's laughter drifting through the house. Instead, she found a row of bags and boxes lined neatly along the porch. At first, her mind refused to process what she was seeing. The beige duffel she had owned since college, the plastic storage bin with Evan's crayons and school notebooks, the dented suitcase with the broken zipper she used for laundry runs, all placed outside like donations for a charity pickup. Her mother-in-law, Margaret Collins, opened the door before Hannah could force a word from her throat. Margaret's mouth was pressed into a straight line that looked carved into stone rather than formed by living muscles. She stood in the doorway like a final judgment. "We discussed this," Margaret said, though they had discussed nothing of the sort. "We can't keep supporting this situation. It's not healthy for anyone. You need to start your own life again." Hannah's voice caught painfully in her chest as though her ribs were crushing it. I don't have anywhere else to go today." "Evan, we've been more than patient," Margaret cut in, "but it's been years since Daniel passed and—" She paused, sighing heavily. "You're not moving on, and frankly, neither are we. This isn't your home anymore." Behind her appeared Margaret's husband, Robert, who avoided looking directly at Hannah. And then Daniel's sister, Claire, arms folded in satisfaction she made no attempt to hide. Claire always hovered nearby, as though waiting for the moment she could reclaim every inch of space that had once belonged to her brother. Hannah tried to reason with them, tried to beg for one more week, even just a few days. But the answers were cold, firm, repeated in tones that made it clear her presence had already been erased from their lives. She had been a widow too long, a burden too persistent, a reminder of a son they had lost and a life they no longer wanted to acknowledge. So she took the bags. She took Evan's hand, and she walked away. The bus stop under the flickering street lamp became their temporary shelter, the only place where she could sit long enough to let the shock settle into her bones. The wind scraped at her coat, and Evan leaned into her, asking the questions she could not yet answer. Why couldn't they go back? What did Grandma mean? Where would they sleep tonight? She had no answers, only the dull terror of uncertainty and a rapidly diminishing amount of money in her wallet. It was in that cold, numbing moment that a memory flickered in her mind, quiet, distant, nearly forgotten. Her mother's voice from years ago, talking about an old ranch in Wyoming that had once belonged to Hannah's grandfather, Walter Grant, a place she had visited maybe once as a child. A house her mother never sold because no one wanted to buy that patch of overgrown land lost somewhere between forgotten highways and dry hills. A house that lived in family stories as something useless, too far away, too old to matter. Yet now, on a cold sidewalk with nowhere else to go, even a broken, abandoned house felt like a lifeline. The decision wasn't heroic. It wasn't even certain. It was simply the only choice that wasn't despair. She checked the remaining bus schedules with fingers stiff from wind and fear. She could afford a multi-stop bus route that would eventually cross into northern Wyoming, though it would leave her with almost nothing afterward. She hesitated only a moment before buying the tickets. Choices were luxuries she no longer had. The journey lasted hours, then a night, then another day blurred into a monotony of gray roads, stations smelling of reheated meals, and the soft weight of Evan's head on her lap as he slept through the worst of it. She felt each mile like a slow unspooling of the life she had once known. By the time the bus finally pushed through the open stretches of Wyoming, She felt stripped down to something leaner and harder, as though survival had taken up residence where comfort once lived. When the driver called out her stop, she stepped off into air that felt cleaner, colder, and startlingly vast. There was no town here, just a long road, a line of distant trees, and land stretching in every direction. She remembered enough to know that the ranch wasn't far, though the road seemed unfamiliar in adulthood. The wind pulled at her hair as she hoisted her bags and motioned for Evan to follow. The walk was long, the sky shifting from pale afternoon to the bruised colors of early evening. Evan trudged beside her, too tired to complain, clinging to her sleeve as though anchoring himself to the only safe thing left in the world. Then at last the house came into view. It stood alone on the land, its structure sagging, the paint stripped away, one corner of the roof bowed inward as if exhausted by its own weight. The porch leaned dangerously, the windows clouded with dust or boarded entirely. Tall grasses choked the path to the door, brushing against her legs like skeletal fingers. It was worse than she remembered, and yet it was theirs. Every crooked board, every nail sinking into dry wood. Her heart twisted at the sight. Relief and despair tangled inside her. This wasn't a home. It was a remnant of one, but it was standing, and at that moment that was more than she had. Inside, the air was stale, thick with years of neglect. The floor creaked under her shoes, and dust swirled in the thin beam of fading daylight. Someone long ago had left old furniture behind, a couch draped in a sheet gone gray, a kitchen table missing a leg, a few chairs with frayed cushions. A house paused in time and left to decay. Hannah forced the windows open to let the cold air push out the old smell. She found blankets in a battered closet upstairs, shaking out the dust with trembling hands while Evan clung to her side. Fear had narrowed his world to the span of her arm, and she spoke softly to reassure him, even though her own chest felt empty of certainty. For the first time since leaving Nebraska, she allowed herself to cry, though she did it silently as she worked. The tears didn't come from weakness. They came from the grief of everything lost, everything broken, everything that had forced them here. But the house didn't judge her. It simply stood there, waiting for someone to bring it back to life. They slept curled together on the floor that night, wrapped in the salvaged blankets. The wind howled through gaps in the walls, and the silence in between was so deep it seemed to vibrate. Evan fell asleep quickly, exhausted by travel and fear, his small hand clutching the fabric of her sleeve. Hannah lay awake with her eyes open, watching moonlight seep through a crack in the window frame. This wasn't a home, not yet, maybe not ever in the way she once imagined a home to be. But it was a place to exist, to start again, to breathe without being told she was a burden. It was the first place in a long time where no one could ask her to leave. By morning, after the coldest night she could remember, she rose with a mix of determination and dread. She surveyed the damage in daylight, the peeling walls, the damaged floorboards, the dust that coated every surface. She knew repairing the house would take more than she currently had, but she also knew that she had survived the previous night, and sometimes survival was the first sign of possibility. Over the next days, she cleaned, scrubbed, sorted, and uncovered pieces of her grandfather's life that still lingered in the debris. She made plans to find work, to reconnect electricity someday, to turn this ruin into something livable, one room at a time. The nearest town was miles away, but reachable. With enough strength and stubbornness, she could carve a life from this desolation. She had walked away from everything she knew, forced out by people who claimed to care. But here, in the shadow of a house the world had forgotten, Hannah Collins felt the faintest pull of hope, fragile as a thread but strong enough to hold on to. She didn't know yet that beneath the crumbling floors and dust-thick corners lay something else, something her grandfather had hidden with a purpose, something that would one day shift the ground under her feet again. For now, she only knew that she and Evan had survived the worst day of their lives, and that was enough to keep moving. Everything else, even the future, could wait until morning. The first weeks on the ranch passed in a blur of exhaustion and instinctive determination, as though Hannah were learning to breathe in a new, colder atmosphere. She awoke every morning stiff from the draft that crept through the walls, her muscles aching from the previous day's cleaning and hauling, but she forced herself to stand, to move, to continue transforming the collapsing structure into something resembling shelter. She worked while Evan drew shapes in the dusty floor with a stick or examined the forgotten relics scattered across the property. Even if the house remained half-ruined, Hannah focused on the parts that could be made safe. She taped over shattered windows, shoved rolled blankets beneath doors with gaping cracks at their bases, and swept pathways through the dust thick enough to cloud the air like smoke. As the sun rose and fell over the hills, she began to understand the rhythms of the land, how the wind picked up in the late afternoon, how the temperature dropped sharply after sunset, how quiet the fields became at night. Sounds that would have frightened her back in Nebraska, snap of wood, thud of shifting beams, rustle behind walls became familiar. There was a life in the house, though of the persistent, small kind. Mice scurried inside the gaps, insects nested in corners, and old boards groaned as if adjusting to new occupants. Each day, Hannah fought the sense of being overwhelmed by the magnitude of the work. She focused on a single room at a time, sometimes a single corner. She cleaned the living room until the old wooden floor beneath the grime showed faint hints of warmth. She cleared out debris from the kitchen, discarding rusted pans and wiping years of dust from shelves. She even attempted to freshen the air by boiling water with what little cinnamon she had left from her time in Nebraska, letting the faint scent drift through the house. It was a small comfort, but one she desperately needed. Evan watched her efforts with wide, solemn eyes, doing his best to help, though he was too young to lift more than a few items. He rearranged bottles, held brooms, and carried small rags from one room to another. When Hannah found him talking quietly to one of the old chairs as if greeting a friend, she realized he was trying to make sense of this strange new world in his own way. She knelt beside him, brushing hair from his forehead, and promised that they would make the ranch warm and bright someday. The promise felt impossibly large, but speaking it aloud gave her strength. Once she had made the kitchen and living room minimally livable, Hannah turned her attention to the practical necessity of survival. Their food supplies dwindled fast. The few canned goods she had brought, combined with the remnants left in the ranch pantry, were barely enough for a week. She needed a way to earn money, and she needed it soon. The nearest town, though small, had a handful of businesses, and she was determined to speak to every manager, owner, or employee willing to listen. The problem was distance. The old ranch sat miles from town, and Hannah owned no car. Each morning before sunrise, she wrapped Evan in the warmest clothes they had and walked with him to the end of the long dirt road. There she waited for the school bus, relieved beyond measure when the driver accepted Evan without question. Once the bus pulled away, she began the long trek toward town. The air was cold enough to sting her lungs, and the wind whipped her hair behind her, but she pressed on, driven by the relentless urgency of necessity. When she finally reached the town's central street, she forced herself to stand tall, despite her aching legs. She visited the family-owned diner where the smell of coffee drifted through the windows, the gas station with its buzzing neon sign, the grocery store with faded sale posters taped to the windows, and even a hardware shop that had more dust than customers. She explained her situation simply. She needed work of any kind. Some people responded with polite regret, others with cautious sympathy, but almost all hesitated when they heard how far she lived. Without transportation, they warned, she would have trouble arriving reliably, especially once winter worsened. Still, she filled out every application. She wrote her new address carefully, though she noticed the skeptical looks that followed the mention of her remote location. She thanked each person sincerely, even when their eyes clearly said no. And then she walked back to the ranch, her muscles burning, her feet blistered, her hope thin but not extinguished. After several days of searching, she received a call from a man named Joe, the owner of the diner. His voice was rough, tired, and blunt, but not unkind. He warned her that the hours were long, the pay was minimal, and the customers could be demanding. But he needed someone who could learn quickly and show up consistently. When she explained her transportation problem, he paused, then admitted he had an old bicycle gathering dust in his garage. If she was willing to fix it up a bit, she could use it. Her relief was so overwhelming she had to sit down before she dropped the phone. The next morning she rode to town with the bicycle, its chains squeaking, the handlebars slightly crooked, but it carried her faster than her own legs ever could. She felt a pang of pride as she pedaled down the long stretches of road, her breath forming clouds in the frosty air. She was moving, advancing, clawing her way toward stability. Work was exhausting, but she welcomed it. She served steaming plates of eggs, refilled mugs of coffee, wiped down tables sticky with syrup, and learned the faces of regulars. Some customers smiled at her, others barely noticed her. Joe himself, though gruff, treated her with a direct fairness that felt like a gift after the passive hostility she had endured in Nebraska. On days when her shift ended late, she returned to the ranch with stars overhead and her lungs aching from the cold. Evan, having taken the school bus home, met her at the door with drawings from class, his eyes bright despite the dim light inside the house. They ate simple meals, canned soup, rice, bread when she could afford it, and huddled beneath blankets in the living room near the small portable heater she had managed to purchase with her first week's tips. Winter approached with a slow, unrelenting chill. Each morning she felt another degree of cold seep into the floorboards, another draft whistle through the walls, another layer of frost settle on the windows. She patched holes in the walls with old rugs and taped cardboard over a broken window in the hallway. When the wind howled across the land like a living thing, she sat closer to Evan and told him stories about her own childhood, about the grandmother he never met, about the land around them that once housed horses and cattle. Despite all her efforts, the house remained fragile, a structure fighting against time and weather. On the night the storm arrived, Hannah sensed something different in the air, long before the first gust hit the walls. The sky outside had darkened early, and the wind carried a strange metallic cold that made her skin prickle. By sunset, the gusts had become violent, banging against the house with unsettling force. She lit every lantern she had, their flames trembling in the draft-heavy air as she and Evan settled close to the heater. Thunder cracked across the land, shaking the house so hard that dust drifted down from the ceiling. Evan whimpered, clutching her waist, and she pulled him close, murmuring comforts she wasn't sure she believed. The storm intensified, each gust blasting against the ranch like a wave crashing onto rocks. Hannah stared at the front door, half afraid it might swing open on its own. She began mentally mapping the strongest points of the house where they would go if something collapsed. The fear pressed heavily inside her, but she forced her breath steady. She could not let Evan see her panic. Then came a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was deeper, heavier, as though something gave way beneath the house. A sharp, splintering crack, followed by the muted thud of collapsing wood from somewhere below. Hannah froze. Her first thought was foundation damage. Her second was something worse, that the basement, old and unstable, had caved in. Evan looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes. She kissed his forehead, telling him to stay on the couch no matter what. Her heart hammered in her chest as she found a flashlight and opened the basement door. The smell hit her immediately. Damp earth, stale air, and the faint scent of must that had grown stronger since they arrived. She took the steps one at a time, testing each plank, aware that one wrong move might send her tumbling. Downstairs, the shadows seemed thicker, the air colder. The storm's voice was muffled here, but its tremors still pulsed through the walls. Hannah swept the beam of the flashlight across the clutter, the old workbench, rotting crates, rusted gardening tools, and a shelf that looked oddly tilted. The shelf had collapsed, spilling paint cans and cardboard boxes across the dirt floor. But it wasn't the shelf that made her gasp. Behind it, exposed by the shift in the house's frame, was a section of wall that looked subtly different from the rest. The boards were arranged in a way that didn't match the natural structure. There was no dust on the seams, as though they hadn't been touched by the decades of neglect that had settled over the rest of the basement. Curiosity warred with fear as she approached. She touched one board, feeling it loosen beneath her hand. Another came free with startling ease, as if time had conspired with the storm to reveal this hidden space. When she removed enough boards to see inside, her flashlight beam caught the outline of a small chamber beyond the wall. It wasn't large, just a few feet in each direction, but it was unmistakably a deliberate, man-made enclosure. The air within seemed oddly still, untouched by the drafts of the basement. And in the center of this secret room stood a metal safe. It was old, solid, and imposing, clearly designed in an era when such safes were built to withstand fire, water, and time. Dust coated the top, but the structure itself looked shockingly intact, as though someone had protected it carefully. Hannah felt her breath catch. A hidden room, a hidden safe. None of this made sense. Her grandfather, the quiet, plain-living man her mother remembered with affection, had never hinted at anything like this. She stepped through the gap, her boots crunching softly on the undisturbed dirt. Her flashlight trembled in her hand as she approached the safe. She expected to lock something that would require tools or brute force. But when she grasped the handle and turned, the door swung open with barely any resistance. Her heartbeat roared in her ears as the interior of the safe came into view. Inside was an array of items arranged with meticulous care. There were envelopes sealed with wax long worn away, thick folders tied with aging string, and several small pouches made of worn leather. Hannah lifted one pouch, startled by the weight inside. Papers, land deeds, maps, certificates, all of them bearing names and dates that felt like scraps of another lifetime. She didn't understand their significance, not yet, but even in her confusion she felt the gravity of what she had uncovered. Clutching the pouch and a handful of documents, she hurried back upstairs to the living room, where Evan was still huddled on the couch. She wrapped an arm around him and waited for the storm to subside, her mind racing with questions that no one alive could probably answer. What had her grandfather kept hidden beneath the ranch all these years? Why had he constructed a secret room? Why leave the safe unlocked? And most unsettling of all, what exactly had she found? And how might it change the fragile life she was struggling to rebuild? The storm raged outside, but inside Hannah felt the first spark of something new. Not hope, at least not yet, but something close to it. A sense that the ranch, which had seemed only a burden of decay and hardship, carried a deeper story than she had ever imagined. A story that might yet alter the path she had been forced onto. She held Evan close as the wind battered the walls, unaware that the discovery she had stumbled upon in the cold belly of the house would soon lead her into a future she could not have imagined. A future written years before she was born and hidden beneath the dust of her grandfather's secrets. For days after the storm, Hannah found herself moving through the house in a strange haze, as if the walls carried a new weight, as if the air had thickened with the presence of something she couldn't yet name. The hidden room in the basement lingered in her mind like a half-remembered dream, as if part of her still doubted that it existed at all. Every time she descended the stairs, she half expected the broken boards to be back in place, the wall restored, the safe gone. But each time she reached the bottom, there it was, unchanged, quiet, waiting. And each time she felt the same uneasy mix of gratitude and fear. By daylight, the documents looked even older and more fragile than they had under the narrow beam of her flashlight. She spread them across the kitchen table, weighing down the curling corners with mugs and canned goods. The morning chill crept through the cracks of the windows, but she ignored it, her focus fixed on the faded ink, the signatures, the embossed seals still visible despite decades of vanishing color. Evan sat on the floor nearby, building small forts out of empty boxes, glancing up at her from time to time as though sensing that something beyond his understanding was happening. She traced her grandfather's name, Walter Granigan, and again where it appeared on certificates, maps, and legal contracts. She read phrases that meant little to her. Mineral rights, exploratory shares, geological survey agreements. Some documents dated back to the 1940s, others to the early 1960s. She had never imagined that the man she remembered as quiet, gentle, almost reclusive, could have been involved in anything so complex. Her memories of him were fragmented. A warm lap during thunderstorms, a deep voice reading aloud in the evenings, the smell of pipe tobacco and old books. Nothing about him had suggested hidden wealth or secret involvement in mining ventures. Yet here it was, undeniable evidence that he had owned something significant. Whether it still existed in any meaningful form, however, was another matter entirely. Her first instinct was to dismiss the possibility that these documents held any real worth. After all, companies collapsed all the time, especially small local ventures like the ones referenced in the papers. What were the chances that a business from 70 years ago was still operating? But the phrase that stuck with her, Rocky Mountain Exploration Company, appeared so frequently in the documents that she couldn't ignore it. The name nagged at her until finally, on a rare evening when her phone held a charge long enough, she typed it into the search bar. When the search results appeared, she stared at the screen in stunned silence. The company was not only real, it had grown into one of the most successful privately held energy and resource extraction companies in the region. It now operated under a slightly altered name, but the lineage was clearly documented in public filings and business articles. A shiver ran down her spine as she realized that she was staring at the evolution of what her grandfather once held stock in. The company had changed, merged, expanded, become something far beyond its original form. But threads of its history were unmistakable. Hannah set her phone down slowly, almost afraid to touch it again. The implications were too big, too overwhelming, too impossible to grasp all at once. She closed her eyes and took a long breath, letting the cold air fill her lungs. She needed help, real professional help. Someone who understood how to navigate corporate records, inheritance laws, and the labyrinth of stock conversions over decades of restructuring. She thought of the attorney in Nebraska who had helped with Daniel's estate, a woman named Patricia Jones, who had handled her case with more compassion than Hannah had expected from a lawyer. Though they hadn't spoken in years, Hannah felt a spark of hope as she remembered Patricia's steady voice and thoughtful explanations. After putting Evan to bed, she pulled out her phone again and dialed the number she had saved long ago. To her relief, Patricia answered, her tone warm and familiar. Hannah explained everything: the storm, the hidden room, the safe, the papers. Patricia listened without interruption, though Hannah sensed her surprise growing with each sentence. When Hannah finished, there was a pause long enough to make her wonder if the call had dropped. "Hannah," Patricia said finally, her voice measured, "if these documents are what you say they are, you may be in possession of assets with substantial value. I want to help you, but this will require someone who specializes in corporate law and securities. I can refer you to a colleague in Cheyenne who handles these kinds of cases. Would you be willing to bring the documents to my office first so I can verify what you found?" The next morning, Hannah bundled the most important-looking papers into a folder, tucked it under her jacket, and made the long bicycle ride into town with a sense of purpose that steadied her hands despite the icy wind. Evan caught the school bus as usual, unaware of the shift beginning to take shape in his mother's world. Patricia greeted her with the same kindness Hannah remembered. The older woman spread the papers across her desk, inspecting each one with careful attention. She took notes, ran brief searches on her computer, and occasionally leaned back in her chair with an expression of deep concentration. When she finally spoke, her voice held a weight Hannah had never heard before. "These documents are legitimate," Patricia said. "And if the shares were never formally transferred or liquidated before your grandfather's death, then legally speaking, they passed to your mother and then to you." Hannah's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She felt as though she were balancing on the edge of something enormous, something she couldn't yet see clearly. Patricia continued, "I'm contacting a securities attorney I trust. His name is David Lawson. He's experienced with cases like this: old stock, forgotten ownership stakes, rights that have carried over through mergers. I believe he'll take your case." Within days, Hannah found herself sitting across from David in the law firm's conference room, feeling out of place in her worn coat and calloused hands. David, a precise man with silver-rimmed glasses, studied the documents with a quiet focus that both reassured and frightened her. After an hour of reviewing, cross-referencing, and scribbling calculations, he finally closed the ledger and looked at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "I can't make promises yet. We need to run a comprehensive investigation, but preliminarily, there is a strong possibility that your grandfather's original stake in what is now Rocky Mountain Resource Consortium remains valid." Hannah blinked, her mind struggling to catch up. "What does that mean? In practical terms?" David folded his hands. "If the ownership converted properly through each corporate transition, and from what I've seen so far, it likely did, then you may hold a percentage of a company now valued in the hundreds of millions. Your share would be a fraction of that, but still significant. The word hung in the air, immense and almost unreal. The next weeks became a whirlwind of phone calls, emails, notarized documents, and meetings. David's team combed through archives, corporate histories, old government filings, and obscure microfilm records. They traced every merger, every restructuring, every stock split, every ownership shift. Each step connected another thread, weaving the past into the present with painstaking accuracy. The more they uncovered, the more surreal the situation felt. Hannah went to work each day, served coffee and burgers at the diner, then returned home to a world slowly tilting beneath her feet. One afternoon after a particularly long shift, she returned to the law office to find David waiting with a stack of printed reports. His face was serious, but there was something in his eyes, something like triumph restrained by professionalism. "We have the confirmation," he said. "Your grandfather's shares converted at every stage. They were never sold, never absorbed, never canceled. You are the legal heir to a 3.2% ownership stake in the current company." Hannah felt her breath catch. The room seemed to tilt as the reality settled over her. David continued, "At the company's current valuation, that equates to approximately $257 million. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Hannah's fingers twisted in her lap as she stared down, unable to speak. She felt as though she had been struck by a wave powerful, overwhelming, impossible to resist. She thought of the nights on the floor with Evan, of the thin blankets, the hunger, the cold. She thought of the storm, the hidden wall, the safe with its unlocked door. She thought of her grandfather, living simply in a house that held a treasure he'd never used. Eventually, the company's executives contacted David directly to discuss options. They were startled and unsettled by the sudden emergence of a significant shareholder they hadn't anticipated. They offered to buy the shares from Hannah immediately, for a price slightly above their calculated value, hoping to maintain their internal power balance without introducing a new stakeholder with voting rights. David spent several days reviewing the offer before presenting it to her. "You don't have to sell," he told her gently. "You have the right to retain ownership. You could receive dividends, have influence over company decisions, but it would also be complex. There would be ongoing legal responsibilities, financial decisions, potential conflicts." She listened quietly, weighing the options the way she once weighed how many cans of soup she could buy with a few spare dollars. The contrast was almost painful. "What would you do?" she finally asked. David considered before answering. "If you want stability for yourself, for your son, I would accept the offer. It is generous, and it will free you from any future corporate entanglements." She nodded. In truth, she already knew her answer. Her life was not built for boardrooms or corporate power. She wanted safety, peace, a home where Evan could sleep without fear of wind whistling through the walls. She wanted to repair the ranch, build something from her grandfather's legacy, rather than manage a company's affairs. She signed the agreement with shaking hands. 30 days, David explained, and the funds would be transferred after final regulatory approval. 30 days in which she continued working at the diner, riding the old bicycle, patching walls in the evenings, boiling water for warmth. 30 days in which she told no one, not even the townspeople who smiled at her as she poured their coffee, not even Joe, who joked about her becoming part of the diner family. And then one morning, when she checked her bank account on her cracked phone screen, she saw more numbers than she had ever imagined possible. More numbers than she had believed a person could have. She closed her eyes as tears streamed down her cheeks. Not of joy, though joy was there, but of release, of exhaustion, of finally dropping a weight she had carried for years. She felt the invisible presence of her grandfather, and though she didn't speak aloud, she whispered a silent thank you to the man who had left her more than a decaying house. He had left her a future, but Hannah did not yet know that this fortune, born from dust and hidden walls, would become more than salvation. It would reshape her life in ways she had not anticipated, guiding her choices, testing her strength, and closing a circle she had not realized was open. Though she didn't fully understand it yet, the discovery had only been the beginning of her journey, not the end. And while the ranch had been neglected for decades, its story and hers was just beginning to unfold. The weeks that followed the confirmation of the funds were unlike anything Hannah had ever lived through. Even after the numbers settled into her account, so many digits that her mind refused to fully register them, she continued moving through her days with a kind of reverent caution, as though afraid a sudden noise might shatter the illusion. She still rose early, still packed Evan's lunch, still walked him to the end of the dirt road to meet the school bus. She still went to the diner, though she had already informed Joe that she would soon be leaving the job to focus on repairing the ranch and stabilizing her new life. He had stared at her for a long moment, then nodded with a gruff sort of approval, as though he sensed that she was stepping into something bigger, but didn't want to pry into her reasons. She appreciated him for that more than he knew. Evenings became a time of quiet planning. She sat at the kitchen table, still shaky, still missing one corner leg, and spread before her the notebooks, brochures, and financial reports she had begun collecting at David Lawson's suggestion. The house was dim except for the lanterns, but she no longer minded the gloom. She used it as a backdrop for imagining light. She spoke with accountants and real estate consultants, with nonprofit specialists and contractors. She asked endless questions, sometimes circling back to the same concepts 3 times because she feared misunderstanding something important. And each professional responded with patience. Perhaps they sensed the gravity of the moment in her voice, the way she leaned toward every answer, as though constructing her future one sentence at a time. It was David who suggested she consider establishing a long-term plan to safeguard the funds for Evan's future. He arranged meetings with financial advisors who helped her draft a structure that balanced security with opportunity. She felt proud of herself, cautiously, humbly proud, for not being swept away by the suddenness of wealth. Instead, she clung to the lessons hardship had cut into her bones. Nothing lasts unless you guard it carefully. And a fortune, she realized, needed guarding most of all. Once the financial foundation was built, she turned her attention to the ranch. Her grandfather's land, once a burden, now felt like a sacred space deserving renewal. When the contractors arrived, men and women with clipboards, measuring tape, heavy boots, they walked through the house with assessing eyes, noting every sagging beam, every weakened wall, every buckled floorboard. They asked questions she didn't always know how to answer, but she trusted them. When they returned later with a detailed plan for the renovation, she reviewed the documents slowly, running her fingers over each line even though the financial cost made her breath catch. It didn't matter. The ranch was home, and she wanted it restored with dignity. Work began quickly. The first weeks were the loudest the ranch had been in decades. Hammers echoed across the fields. Sawdust drifted like light snow. Machinery grumbled and roared. The porch was replaced, the roof restructured, the walls reinforced. New wiring brought electricity back to the house, and plumbing that had been rusted and cracked for years was replaced with modern systems. Hannah stood in the yard each afternoon while Evan played nearby, watching the workers transform the structure piece by piece. She felt something healing inside her with each improvement, as if the house's restoration mirrored her own. By the time spring arrived, the ranch looked like the ghost of its former self had been gently persuaded to rise again. The exterior glowed with fresh paint, the windows gleamed with new glass, and the interior had become spacious, warm, and full of sunlight. Evan had a room of his own, decorated with soft blues and shelves for books, and when he first stepped into it, he stood frozen, speechless, his small chest rising and falling with emotion he didn't yet have words for. Hannah knelt beside him and held him close, savoring the weight of the moment. To give a child safety, it was a feeling unlike any other. With the house stable, she felt a growing urge to use her grandfather's gift for more than personal comfort. She remembered nights spent shivering with Evan in their old Nebraska bedroom. The walls paper thin as her in-laws whispered about her being a burden. She remembered staring at empty cupboards, stretching meals across days, pretending to Evan that everything was fine. She remembered searching online for local charities that might offer help and discovering how little there was for women in her situation unless they were escaping something dramatic or violent. She had not been abused. She had simply been abandoned. That kind of suffering seemed to fall between the cracks of institutional support. So she created the answer she wished had existed for her. With guidance from Patricia, David, and a nonprofit consultant named Elise, she founded the Grant Haven Foundation, named in honor of her grandfather. The mission was simple but profound: to provide immediate, practical assistance to single parents facing homelessness or unexpected displacement. Not just food or used clothes, but emergency housing, legal support, transportation assistance, and pathways back to stability. She refused to build a charity that relied on pity. She wanted a place that treated every parent with dignity, every child with compassion. The local community reacted first with curiosity, then admiration. The story of a once struggling mother who found a way to rebuild her life and chose to help others spread quickly through town. The newspaper ran an article about her efforts, accompanied by a photograph of her standing in front of the renovated ranch with Evan at her side. Reporters from neighboring towns and counties began contacting her, asking for interviews. Businesses reached out with donations. Volunteers came forward. The foundation grew faster than she expected, and soon she hired a small staff to manage daily operations. Hannah never told anyone about the extent of her wealth. She let people assume what they wanted, that she had inherited enough to get by, that she was simply fortunate. The truth didn't feel like something she needed to display. It was private, sacred in a way, tied not only to her grandfather's legacy, but to her own journey from desperation to stability. She thought she had left the past behind, but pasts have a way of resurfacing. It happened when an article about the Grant Haven Foundation was picked up by a regional magazine with a significant readership. The writer, admiring her work, included a brief mention of the unusual circumstances that had led her to refurbish her grandfather's ranch. He didn't give numbers or details, but the implications were clear. She had come into enough money to make a difference on a significant scale. Margaret Collins read the article. Hannah learned this on a bright Thursday morning when a car she recognized all too well. Its pale green paint, its dented bumper pulled into her gravel driveway. The crunch of tires on stone made her stomach tighten, and when she stepped outside onto the porch, she saw Margaret emerging from the driver's seat, her expression pinched and sour, as though the very air of Wyoming offended her. For a long, silent moment, the two women stared at each other. The contrast between who Hannah had been the last time they stood face to face and who she was now felt like a chasm between worlds. Margaret's gaze flicked over the renovated ranch, taking in the new porch railings, the fresh wood, the manicured yard. Her mouth tightened further. "So," Margaret said, her voice sharp enough to cut, "this is where you've been." Hannah held the door frame lightly, grounding herself. "Yes, this is home." Margaret stepped closer, eyes narrowed. "You should have told us. You should have said something. We deserve to know." "Know what?" Hannah asked, though she already sensed where this was going. "That you were sitting on money. That you were wealthy." "Cerny." Margaret's voice trembled with outrage and something else, envy, perhaps, or disbelief. "We took you in. We supported you for years after Daniel died. We had the right to know you had access to a fortune." Hannah blinked, stunned by the audacity. "I didn't have access to anything then. I didn't even know it existed. And when I left your house, I had $42 to my name and nowhere to go." Margaret waved this off as though it were irrelevant. "But you do now. And Evan is Daniel's son. That means part of whatever you have belongs to our family." Hannah felt something inside her cool into steel. She stepped down from the porch, closing the space between them until she could see the fine lines of indignation around Margaret's eyes. "You told me I wasn't your responsibility," she said quietly. "You made that very clear. You placed our belongings on your porch and shut the door behind us. I begged for time, and you refused. Everything that has happened since then happened because I was left on the side of a road with a child and no home." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "We didn't mean to." "Yes, you did," Hannah interrupted. "You meant every word, and you have no claim to anything in my life now. You forfeited that when you turned us out. Evan has a future now. He has a home, a community, and a mother who will never let him feel unwanted again. That is all he needs." For a moment she saw a flicker of something, regret, confusion, maybe even shame in Margaret's eyes. But it vanished quickly, replaced by a defensive scowl. "This isn't over," Margaret snapped. "We have lawyers too." Hannah didn't answer. She simply turned and walked back toward the house, leaving the older woman standing alone in the driveway. When she reached the door, she looked back once, but the car was already pulling away, its tires spitting gravel in its wake. The encounter left her shaken but not frightened. That part of her life, the dependence, the begging, the quiet suffering, was over. The ranch had become more than a home. It had become a sanctuary, a symbol of the strength she had found in herself, the strength that had been forged through hardship and loss. Months passed, then a year. Evan grew taller, more confident. The foundation flourished, its programs expanding, its reach widening. Hannah watched dozens of families find their footing again through the support she had helped create. Each time she saw a parent step into stable housing or land a new job, she felt a warmth that no amount of money could match. And yet, echoes of the past resurfaced once more, this time in the form of a phone call. It was from a hospital in Nebraska. Robert Collins, her father-in-law, had suffered a severe stroke and was unlikely to recover. For a long moment, Hannah simply held the phone to her ear, listening to the soft hum on the other end. The memories came unbidden. Robert teaching Daniel how to fix an engine, Robert offering her tea after Daniel's funeral, Robert sitting silent at the dinner table as Margaret criticized her. He had not defended her in those final months, but he had also not attacked her. He had been a quiet bystander swept along in his wife's tide. In the end, she chose compassion. She traveled to Nebraska alone, leaving Evan with friends on the ranch. The hospital room was dim, machines beeping softly. Margaret and Claire were there, their eyes hard when she entered. She didn't speak to them. Instead, she went to Robert's bedside, where he lay frail and pale, his once strong hands limp against the sheets. She sat down quietly and folded her fingers around his. His eyelids fluttered, though she didn't know whether he recognized her or merely sensed warmth. "I wanted you to know," she said softly, "that Evan is well. He has a good life, a safe life, and I don't hold anger in my heart anymore. I truly don't." "Sakram." Margaret stiffened, but Hannah didn't look at her. She stayed only a short while, then rose, touched Robert's hand one last time, and left the room. She didn't turn back. She didn't need to. The chapter had been closed long before she stepped through that door. Life on the ranch continued, unfolding in seasons of growth and renewal. Evan blossomed under the stability and love that surrounded him. He learned to ride horses from a neighbor, planted vegetables in the garden, and joined Hannah on visits to the Foundation's community housing units, where he played with children whose experiences mirrored his younger years. By the time he turned 13, he had begun volunteering regularly, earning the admiration of staff and families alike. On his birthday, Hannah led him downstairs to the basement, where she had installed a protective glass wall around the hidden room. The safe remained inside, empty but dignified, a silent monument to everything that had shaped their lives. Evan stood before it in awe, running a hand along the glass. "This is where it all began?" he asked. Hannah nodded. "Where it changed, yes. But the real beginning was long before this. When we arrived here with nothing, when we decided we would build something anyway." Evan looked up at her with a smile that reminded her so much of Daniel, it made her chest ache. "You did all of it," he said. "No," she whispered, touching his cheek. "We did." Years later, when Evan attended college and eventually returned to work full-time with the Foundation, Hannah watched him with a pride that bordered on wonder. He had become the embodiment of everything she had hoped her efforts would create: kind, driven, compassionate, grounded. And she herself had become someone she never imagined possible: strong without hardness, generous without guilt, successful without arrogance. The ranch stood as proof that renewal was always possible, even in the darkest of places. Sometimes at night, after the lights were off and the land lay quiet beneath the moon, she stepped onto the porch and listened to the wind rustling through the fields. The same wind that once made her tremble now carried a gentler voice, as though whispering stories of everything the land had witnessed. She thought often of her grandfather and the gift he had unknowingly left her. She hoped that wherever he was, he knew she had honored it well, not by spending it, but by transforming it into a life that lifted others from the same shadows she had once stood in. The ranch had given her safety, wealth had given her opportunity, but the truest treasure had been something far less tangible: resilience, born of struggle, hope resurrected from despair, the unwavering, unbreakable desire to protect her son and carve out a world where he would never again feel the uncertainty they had once lived through. And so Hannah breathed deeply of the quiet night air, letting it fill her. Her life had begun in hardship, risen from dust and secrets, and blossomed into something beautiful, something worthy of the land that had sheltered her. The safe might have been empty now, but she no longer needed it. The richest part of her story lived outside it, in everything she had built with her own hands. This, she understood at last, was her true inheritance. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and check out my other stories waiting for you. And of course, stay tuned for the next video.